Hi everyone, welcome. Thank you all for joining us. We're just going to see if we can get Pat up on the screen and then we'll get started.
Apologies, we're just trying a new software for made specifically from webinars. So we're just attempting to make Pat McGorry the host. So thanks for bearing with us.
Into your screen and see. We did test this and it was working. We're not really sure what's happened. So just bear with us for a second. Pat, hopefully, yay. Awesome. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for the next webinar in the series supported by Sonder. Sorted it out. Today we're having a chat about early psychosis services in Australia, where are we and what are the next steps. And we're joined today by Professor Patrick McGorry. Thank you so much for joining us, Pat. If you're there. There we go.
Yeah. Sorry, I don't know this program. It's not Zoom. It's not Teams. It's my all my
No,
fault.
it's okay. It's us too. This is our first time using it. So thank you for joining us.
Yeah, great.
So first up, I'll just quickly run through an acknowledgement of country. So we'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. And we pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging. And I'd like to acknowledge the land that we're on today is the land of the Kaurna people. And I should probably introduce myself. So I'm Claire. I'm from the community engagement team here at Headspace Adelaide. And I'm also joined here by Steve Wright, who's the executive manager for youth services at Sonder. We're so grateful for you having the time to come today. So the webinar series that Sonder have been doing, we wanted to just quickly, I guess, plug it here. So we think this webinar series has been great to build the knowledge sharing and inter-agency connectedness within youth services for us in South Australia. Sonder is the largest provider of youth mental health services in the Adelaide metropolitan region. So we thought it was really important that we're able to provide a space where we can all get together and have chats about important topics and disseminate that information amongst us different services. We'd like to acknowledge our funding bodies as well, particularly the Adelaide Primary Health Network, enabling us to provide these services. So just some housekeeping. Everyone's microphones were muted, as some of you have worked out. We're just asking you to use the chat panel today. So if you have any questions while Patrick's having a chat with us, put them in there at the end. We'll have some time for questions. But otherwise, I'd like to introduce Professor Patrick McGorry. So Professor Patrick McGorry, I'd like to think is probably a well-known name for most of us. But if you're not sure, he's an Irish-born Australian psychiatrist known worldwide for his development and scaling up of early intervention and youth mental health services, and for mental health innovation, advocacy, and reform. He's an executive director of Orygen, professor of youth mental health at the University of Melbourne, and founding editor of the journal Early Intervention in Psychiatry. He led the advocacy which resulted in the establishment by the Australian government in 2005 of the National Youth Health Foundation, which in 2006 became Headspace and remains the board member of the organisation. So thank you so much for joining us, Pat, today. We're so excited to have you here to have a chat with us.
Oh, that's lovely. Thanks so much for that great introduction and for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. And can I just check, maybe Steve and
Claire, yeah.
Is the audience Sonder people, or is it more,
yeah? So
more
it's broadly throughout sort of
Mm-hmm.
South Australia. So there's a range of different agencies who are participating, Pat. So frontline staff, whether it be from the PHN or from mental health services within the South Australian metropolitan region. Primarily, that might be CAMS, might be adult mental health, it might be headspace centres. So I have a range of attendees. And I guess the intent is to be able to share knowledge and to build connections, and obviously have some great speakers such as yourself who can share current learnings in the field.
Oh, well, thanks, Steve. That's great. Thanks, Claire. How long have I got?
20 minutes.
Yeah.
So go with even less if you'd like.
And Pat, if you want to share any slides at all, there's a button down the bottom where if you click on, it's like a TV screen. It enables you to start sharing your screen, I think, if you want to at any stage.
Yeah.
Okay. I can't see that button actually on my screen, but I was just wondering, would it be okay not to use slides this time? I've got them here, but I just thought it'd be better just to, if it's only 20 minutes, just to give a bit of a spiel about where we've come, where we might be going to go to, and I suppose the starting point for me is when I first came into psychiatry back in the 1980s, and I heard psychiatrists saying to young people diagnosed with their first episode of psychosis, "Oh, look, I'm really sorry. You've got schizophrenia, and you will never get better. You're going to have severe disability. You'll never work. You'll never get married. So just start getting used to it." You know, it was almost like every last vestige of hope was extracted from that young person and their family at that point. You know, and this is for a treatable illness, right? You know, we're not talking about people who've developed Alzheimer's or terminal cancer or something, but with young people on the threshold of adult life, everything before them, their whole lives before them, they were being told this sort of nonsense, basically, you know, and it was just unbelievable, really. So we set about trying to change that, and probably had to wait a few years before we really got momentum. But in the early 90s, we set up a thing in Melbourne called EPIC. So forgive me, many of the audience know all this history, but maybe some don't, so it's worth just saying it again. And, you know, at the time, obviously schizophrenia and psychotic illnesses were probably the most severe illnesses affecting the young people, that they could actually have had. So to tackle it in this way with a much more hopeful and optimistic approach was pretty radical at that time. But it kind of worked and all we did really was two things. We decided to create, you know, more optimistic cultures of care, you know, the early psychosis sort of culture, where, within that, we tried to find them as soon as possible after they developed the symptoms, you know. So in other words, not waiting for 2 or 3 years until, you know, they've been in their bedroom psychotic for 2 years, and then it was a suicide attempt or an aggressive incident that might have brought them into care with the police in a very traumatic way. That was a terrible way to start treatment of anything, you know. And also, in many ways they'd missed the boat, so it was a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, because it's very hard for them, even if they recovered from the illness, to get back into their trajectory of life. They'd lost their peer group, they lost their education pathways, and they might have got addicted to cannabis in the process, so you basically had a rebuilding project rather than a prevention and recovery project, so early detection, early diagnosis was critical, and that led to sort of breakthroughs like identifying the prodromal or subthreshold at-risk mental state. So when people are showing warning signs like the ultra-high risk state of psychosis, we can try to prevent them even having their first major psychotic break. That was another thing that came out of that early diagnosis idea. But even just shortening the duration of untreated psychosis to maybe a matter of days or weeks rather than letting it go for months or years was a key focus, that detection process. And to do that, you've got to have very accessible, youth-friendly services, which obviously the Headspace Youth Early Psychosis Service have got the best opportunity to do that of any early psychosis services. And the second focus, apart from detection, is actually making sure you give them every chance to get better. And that means not what was happening in the 80s, where they were given heaps of medication, like way over the odds, in terms of medication, excessive doses, and pretty much nothing else apart from medication. And sadly, that's still the case in lots of public mental health services around the world, that's all that happens with early psychosis patients, just the medication. But we decided to develop evidence-based psychosocial treatments, adapting CBT and developing IPS, vocational recovery, a whole range of things, family interventions tailored to that stage of illness. And out of that came the staging framework, where we realized the stage of illness that the young person's at determines the treatment. So if someone has progressed to a very late stage and is quite unwell and disabled and not responsive to treatment, that's more like a stage 4 type case. Well, that person needs a different complexion of treatment. They might need clozapine, they might need much more intensive rehab type programs and maybe residential support, things like that. So depending on the stage of illness, the treatment differs a lot. And in the very earliest stages, we think that just purely psychosocial treatment is enough, especially in that prodromal or pre-psychotic phase. So there are lots of learnings that came from all that. And we set up the International Early Psychosis Association in the late 90s to partner with people all around the world that were having the similar ideas. We created a huge evidence base supporting the effectiveness of these programs, and we lobbied governments, around the world to develop these programs. And as you know, in many countries, they've been scaled up across the whole country, like in Denmark and Canada and, places like that. And the US now too, even, In Australia, we've been very slow. About 10 years ago, we had this initiative that extended the model across, originally it was meant to be 16 locations, ended up being 9 and then shrunk to 6, thanks to Susan Lee, at the time the health minister, who was responsible for also creating PHNs. So she's got 2 capital crimes on her list, And anyway, no offense to PHNs, because they do their best with the model that they've got, but basically the model plateaued at that point, and we couldn't get growth. We couldn't get the scaling up across the whole country. And in fact, she tried to defund the program back in 2016, and we had to basically go to the National Press Club and the Sydney Telegraph to basically, in the election campaign, to cause a backflip from the Prime Minister. He intervened and saved the program and caused massive disruption to all the people working in it, but with these, threats and then, rebirths. It was very disruptive to patients and staff, and and the insecurity of the program has been a major problem, with short contracts and, constant uncertainty. So despite all that, the people working in it, and all of you people in Adelaide are a great example of that, the outcomes are sensational. The outcomes are the best in the world for early psychosis programs, especially in the last few years. So I think it's a great, it's like a hero's journey type story, a reform that's actually been impeded and has been, given every chance to fail, but has actually succeeded despite, and that's thanks to the great efforts of all the people so dedicated that are working in these programs, and pay tribute to all of you people, on the call today, because you're doing wonderful work, and it's changing the world. It's changing the futures for these young people, and it's saving lives, and it's very, very important. And it's the most evidence-based program in the whole of psychiatry. It's got 30 years of really good evidence from many, many jurisdictions around the world that it works. It doesn't cure schizophrenia, but it actually gives people a good life, a better life. And there is a subset of them that are cured, that just have, a brief period of illness of a few months or a few years even, and they come good and their lives are okay. And many others can have, despite some symptoms and disability, can still have very good lives. So it's definitely a recovery orientated project and program, and it's got lessons for the whole of psychiatry and mental health, because lots of other disorders will meet the same pattern. So we've taken a more transdiagnostic approach to youth mental health in the last 20 years, based on the prototype of early psychosis, actually, that we can do this for everything: eating disorders, personality disorders, mood disorders, and mixtures of all of the above, which obviously we all see every day, don't we? I mean, people don't fit into the categories that well, that they overlap quite a lot. And so I think it's been, a great thing, and Australia's been the pioneer, and it's been a national effort, with most states involved. Still, Tassie and ACT are not on board because Susan Lee defunded them, but we'll get that back. So that's kind of a bit of a snapshot of where we've been, why we've come, and it's also been the power of blending clinical academics and clinicians as the sort of drivers of these changes. So people like me who trained in clinical as a clinician, and I put a lot of effort into that in my training in the 80s to try to become the best possible clinician I could. Sort out lots of different sorts of support and supervision and training, and then also trying to develop a research career so I could use the power of research to kind of produce evidence and change the way we work and improve the way we work. And so often in psychiatry, the two things are placed in conflict. Like research is a burden for the patients, and the researchers don't actually put in terms of contributing to the clinical programs and stuff like that. There's division like that, but like in cancer and other areas of healthcare, research is vital if we're going to improve and make new discoveries and also translate things. Because, as you all know, in mental health, everyone's got an opinion, and unless you've got some evidence to back up the opinion, then it's just really we're a bit sort of directionless. So early psychosis platforms and obviously most of them now are connected up with the clinical registry and the clinical trial network that we've been funded by Wellcome to sort of support now. We can continue to test new treatments and produce new evidence and improve the program, and that's a unique thing because we've bonded so much. I think all the different centres around Australia around early psychosis over the last 10 years or so, been through some pretty tough times. We're pretty bonded, and there's a lot of trust and respect for each other across the network. And so in South Australia, you're a member of a family in a way, and that are trying to do something very important. And the other thing just to share some optimistic sort of things for the future, we've lobbied really hard to get the federal government to expand this program, to make it available in more locations across the country, because it's still patchwork, isn't it? It's only in some places. So why should people, say in part of Adelaide, get the benefit of it, whereas perhaps in other parts of South Australia it's not available, or in one part of Melbourne it's available but another part it's not. It's not equitable. So we need to have it everywhere, and it's also the basis or the base camp, I could say, for solving the missing middle problem, because sitting behind headspace as it does and behind primary care, it can provide the next tier or next stage or next sort of level of intensity and tenure of care to people who need more than a headspace centre can provide, and that's true for psychosis, but we need to make that true for mood and borderline and anorexia and all the other potentially serious and persistent conditions that young people might experience. Now, we certainly don't want to dilute the early psychosis, resources and skill and content, but we could add to it, and that's what we did at Orygen back in around 2000. we had our early psychosis program, and we added resources onto it so that it could also look after mood disorders and other conditions. And that's what we're trying to say to the federal government. This is the way forward for dealing with the missing middle. Build on the success of the early psychosis program and augment it with other strings to their bow. And that's what we're trying to basically convince the government to do in the medium term. And also to extend the early psychosis program into places where it currently isn't, like Tasmania and ACT. And I don't know how it's going to go. There's certainly no threat to the program. Greg Hunt and David Collin have both assured me personally that the program will not be at risk, in terms of the funding. So, and they'd be mad politically if they tried to do it again like they did in 2016. We'd be in the media, immediately, and we've got very good ability to deal with that, and they know that, so they're kind of scared. But what we want to do is not just scare them, but inspire them that if they want to solve these problems, then we've got solutions for them, and that's where we're coming from. We've got very good relationships with them these days. It's not like the Susan Lee period, so we've actually we've got very good access and are able to talk to them about these issues on a regular basis. Even the Prime Minister is accessible to us to talk about these issues and supportive of mental health. So I think it's a pretty good scenario. We do want more security. We want the program to go back into the forward estimates like it was originally before Susan Lee. It was taken out, and now it's like they refund it every 2 years sort of thing, which is not right. It's not right for all of the workers working in it to have that insecurity. So we're basically pressing on that issue as well, trying to get security of tenure, and this is why the commissioning model of the PHNs is a problem too, because there's so much short-term commissioning in PHN land as well. So we need to get more security and tenure, and many PHNs understand that and agree with us about that. So hopefully we can make some progress there. The Department of Health federally is also, I think, appreciates the program. Chris Bedford and Mark Rodham in the department there, we talk to them regularly as well. So we're advocating, and we will do everything to protect and grow this program, because it's an incredible piece of real estate and producing tremendous value for the young people in Australia. And we couldn't. No one could do anything without all of you, what you're doing on a day-to-day basis. And we know it's challenging work at times, but very rewarding too. And I've still got patients that I look after. Even to this day, they're probably the same age as me now, some of them, but that I looked after back in the 1980s when we first started doing this work with early psychosis. So it's an incredibly rewarding piece of or area to be working in, and I'm sure many of you already know that and feel it. And the best thing is working with a team that's got hope and optimism and energy and commitment for the young people. And I know known Steve for a number of years, and I know he has that what's the word, value system, and that's what we need to have in youth mental health. And we can have it too, because the young people have got energy, they can contribute to these things through their youth participation and engagement, and it's such a healthy thing, and it's part of something that we should all be very proud of having created together. So that's probably about 20 minutes, isn't it, Steve? And
thank you, Pat. I guess a couple of things that I wanted to ask is going back to that time where you and the team at Orygen were coming up with the concept for the EPIC program. How did that come about? Was it sort of a working through of what you saw working in other parts of the world, or was it a lot of innovation that happened there? You take us back to that time, and how did that all come about?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. I mean, I suppose the influences that I had on me in my training were from a woman called Beverly Raphael. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of her, but she was a professor of psychiatry at the University of Newcastle, where I was working in Newcastle at the time when I started psychiatry, my training. And her big thing was prevention. She set up the first preventive psychiatry centre in Australia, and she had done work on bereavement in widows, and had shown that it came originally, if you go right back to to Boston and Gerald Kaplan and crisis theory, which came out of disasters, where they realized if they intervened preventively after a loss or after grief or after a trauma or loss, that they could prevent mental health consequences. So it was like an early intervention, preventive psychiatry sort of idea. So she influenced me a lot in my thinking and training. And then when I moved to Melbourne, I was always very fascinated by psychosis and schizophrenia, so I wanted to work in that field. But that sort of thinking made me think, well, can't we apply that sort of thinking to schizophrenia and psychosis? And why do we accept this terrible pessimism that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk? Why is it acceptable? We do have treatments. Why would we think that this is an untreatable or deteriorating illness, which was what everyone was saying at the time? You still read scientific papers saying that schizophrenia is a devastating and deteriorating illness. You still read that even today. It came out of the 19th century dementia praecox idea. But so I suppose from that preventive background, I wanted to challenge that and see whether if we did sort of develop early diagnosis and we did treat people properly, then would the outcomes be better? And I was horrified at the way patients were treated, because they were, first of all, the young people were herded together with all the 45-year-olds with long-term illness who had the worst outcomes, and they were a subsample of schizophrenia anyway. So they were presented with a picture of their future, which was devastating. And they were often put in seclusion or given forced sedation or brought in by the police in handcuffs as their first experience of treatment. So they were being traumatized as well. And that's obviously happened even today in adult psychiatry, when the people with lived experience are very critical of adult psychiatry because these things are still happening. And so it was like, first of all, let's stop the harm, the iatrogenic harm, which was those sorts of traumatic experiences which were very common. And also, let's stop the over-medication, because patients were getting about 10 times as much medication as they needed. A drug-naive first episode patient only needs very small amounts of medication to get better. And that was known and proven, around that time. But still, the psychiatrists were giving them, 10 times the dose, because they thought if some is good, more is better, and they'll get better quicker if we give them more medication. Well, there was no evidence for that, and there was lots of evidence that the side effects were very unpleasant and obviously turned the patients off taking medication because they felt worse, not better. So they felt immediately worse from the side effects, and it took weeks for them to get better from the illness. So why would you take medication that did that to you? So you had to be a lot more careful with medication. Medication was essential to most patients, but even just 1 or 2 milligrams of risperidone or haloperidol at the time was enough. And if they were distressed or upset or agitated or angry or whatever, it'd be better to give them some Valium, or some benzos, which actually make them feel better very quickly. So that was the thinking, and you still can't get psychiatrists to do that. By the way, it's challenging. They still tend to over rely on the antipsychotics alone, and also still in adult psychiatry with excessively high doses still, even today. So, but it is better than it was then. Back in the 80s, it was shocking. So first thing was, first do no harm. Let's stop the harmful things, and let's try to build evidence for things that might improve the recovery rate. So in a way, it's kind of common sense, but there wasn't much of it around in those days.
We've got one question in the chat we'll get to shortly, and feel free for other people to add a question or two if you would like to. I guess the other question that I have, Pat, is what's your hope for early psychosis within the next 5-10 year period? What would you like to see within the Australian mental health landscape? Obviously more centres. Do you envisage the service model sort of broadening or changing significantly?
Well, I think this is where innovation might help. We only change it if we think we've got something better to offer, right? So there are probably many things that we could think of that might make things better. One of the things that maybe isn't so evidence-based that I'd like to see in all services for young people would be more use of music and art and more creative sort of things. Where people can express themselves in different ways, and it adds a lot to the culture of a place if you've got that sort of more well-being type things happening as well. Physical health is another thing, making sure that we've got GPs and exercise physiologists and dietitians involved in the services in a stronger way. The vocational bit could probably be strengthened a lot more too. And then if we have other diagnostic streams alongside the early psychosis, maybe the ability to kind of tackle comorbidity a bit better within the early psychosis group. Like, so if they've got personality issues, maybe some other forms of psychotherapy around that, DBT and CAT therapy. And rather than thinking you've got a pigeonhole, I noticed a question about DSM there. You can't pigeonhole these people. They've got syndromes, they've got different, and the syndromes can be comorbid, they can overlap. And so they don't actually have clear-cut diseases per se. They've got syndromal patterns, which we've got treatments for. There's some specificity in the treatment, but their actual needs as people, as young people, overlap across the diagnostic categories. So we can have common vocational programs, for example. We can have common, art and music programs. So that's the richness of a transdiagnostic service. But you've still got to preserve the fidelity to the things in psychosis that do work, within that. And that's hard. That's a hard thing for services to do. Mostly you get the blancmange effect, where once you have a transdiagnostic service, everyone gets the same, dumbed down uniform approach. Whereas that's not what we're saying. We're saying preserve the fidelity, but have some common pools of programs and ways of working, and that's something that's a very high quality thing for us to aspire to over the next few years. But I think we can do it in Australia. We're the best at this, really, when we put our minds to it. So I think we could do it. And then there's research. We've got this massive US grant as well, which is looking at mechanisms in the ultra high risk group, trying to work out what is wrong, what is going wrong at that point when they're becoming unwell, and it's probably focused a bit on the biology of it, in terms of so we can develop better and safer drugs and for the illness, but also what's going wrong psychologically at that point too. Is there a way to understand how stress and other sorts of vulnerability can be worked with in a psychological or social sense as well? And you've probably all seen ultra high risk patients that you thought were going to go down the route of becoming psychotic, but they managed to avoid that pathway. And some, quite often it's because something changed in their life, and the stress was reduced, or something else changed. So it's a very delicate interaction between the biological vulnerability and what's actually going on in their lives, and so being able to work in this holistic way is very important, and not to trash, one or the other. In psychiatry, you see people either trashing the big pharma, the drug side of things on the one hand, or alternatively, placing too much reliance on it. So it's about, so that research it's hopefully going to deliver a pathway to novel and safer treatments.
Fantastic. Look, I think we're almost at time for today, Pat, so I wanted to really just thank you for your time. Within a couple of minutes of me sending you an email to ask if you would present on as part of this webinar, you responded and said no problem at all. So I want to acknowledge that, and obviously your commitment to driving forward with youth mental health models of care and within Australia and internationally. So thank you for your time today. Really appreciate the work that yourself and the team at Orygen do on a day-to-day basis, and look forward to seeing more great ideas come out of your team as we move forward.
Well, thanks, Stephen, for your team great. Too. Well, great to share this time with you all, and best of luck. And if you need anything from us, just get in touch. We're always really happy to
Thanks so much, Pat. All right, you take care. Stay well.
Yes, see you, mate. Bye, everybody.